Good afternoon, this is MuseBeam, and my name is Bob Rixon. Today we're going to hear the first half of a tape, a monologue that Man Ray recorded some years back. Man Ray was born in 1890 in Philadelphia. He studied architecture and engineering. In 1908 he took up study of painting at the National Academy of Design in New York. Formed a long-term friendship with Marcel Duchamp around 1915. In fact, almost killed himself attempting to take a picture of Duchamp's construction revolving glass. He joined with Picabi and Duchamp in the New York Dada movement. And from 1921, he was experimenting with photography, including rayograms, in which you put objects directly on the photo paper. Lived in Paris from 1921 to 1940. Took part in the Surrealist movement. Worked as a photographer. Came back to the U.S. and settled on the West Coast. And he went back to Paris again. Involved in everything. In so many different aspects of American and European art life. During his long life, he died in 1976. So here's part one of the Man Ray monologue. There'll be a slight fluctuation in speed here, the result, I believe, of high-speed dubbing. But it's no problem. Man Ray.
Allow me to introduce myself. I don't know who my public is going to be, but they must surely know who I am. This is Man Ray, American-born, who chose France as his most permanent home. Well, I was born many years ago in 1890. I don't feel that old, although many people have told me that they thought I was dead. I seem to have become a legend, and all legends are supposed to be of the past. The museum has been showing some of my works lately, works I did in 1916. This is perfectly legitimate for a museum of modern art to do. Since then, I have done a great many more works which have not been shown. I am really too busy producing works to show them. Besides, I do not believe in exhibitions. I began my career way back as a painter. I always wanted to paint. When I got out of the public schools, I immediately began to paint. I tried all the art schools in America. One after the other was a disappointment. It seemed to have nothing to do with painting, at least what I wanted to paint. One of the teachers told me one day that he thought that I was interested in painting, but that I had no talent whatever, and it would take me 5 years to win a silver medal. If I wanted to paint, to go out and be on my own. I took his advice, and the very next day began to paint on my own. My subjects were not the subject of the usual art students. Oh, I did a few portraits because the human face always interested me, but I began to invent things, invent subjects for my paintings, such as using the dream as a motive, or some incident in the street, an automobile flashing by, a telegraph pole, a tree that had fallen on a rooftop. Things that were considered not exactly picturesque, let us say. Perhaps that was the beginning of Dadaism. I think my earliest iconoclastic work was a composition looking like a tapestry. I had found a book containing samples of cloths for men's clothes, which I patched together in the form of a cubistic composition, which looked like a dancing figure, and had it all sewn together finally by a seamstress, and it is still hanging in my studio. I consider this one of the most original or revolutionary works I have done. It dates from 1911. I lived in New York from 1912 to 1914, but could no longer keep up with the pace. The rush and bustle and competition around me. So I moved to a little shack in the country in New Jersey. There used to be some sort of an art colony there which had been abandoned, but the shacks were still there, and I installed myself and really began to paint like mad. This was during the First World War. A couple of Frenchmen came over, Francis Picabia and Marcel Duchamp. I met them immediately. While we didn't speak the same language, I spoke hardly any French at the time, we looked at each other's works and we seemed to have something in common. They had both broken away from the cubism of Paris, and I had broken away from the schools around me, or from what my contemporaries were doing. So we sort of stuck together. And I think this was the beginning of the Dada movement in New York. Around 1916, 17, we received a letter from Paris. The Dada group, who had started in Zurich, Switzerland, had moved to Paris. Tristan Tzara, I forget who, one or two others, Swiss or Germans, but they tied up with a young group of poets in Paris, like Breton, Soupeau, Eluard, and Aragon. And they really started the movement of Dada in Paris in its full swing. Duchamp, Picabia, and myself did the same thing in New York, with this difference. And in Paris, it became a great scandal, a great public scandal. In New York, we attracted no attention whatever, except amongst a few intellectuals who disapproved very much of our activities. However, we continued, and our principal object was to defy painting and literature, which is perfectly consistent with the activities of the Parisian Dadaists. The fact that Duchamp and Picabia were both Frenchmen did not influence me, because if I had been like the other Americans, I certainly wouldn't have gone along with them. I already had this instinct in me, and it would have developed whether I'd been encouraged or not. I'd already taken a certain attitude as a result of the reception my work was given by the critics in New York. That is, whatever the others disapproved of, that was the direction I was to take in my production. You see, it is revolutionary, but all worthwhile art is revolutionary. Even in the Middle Ages, when painters working for the church had to paint virgins and saints, they generally managed to introduce an element that was sure to be censored by the officials. Since the 20th century, the 19th century rather, painters had been thrown on their own. They were no longer officially installed in the castles of noblemen and ecclesiastics. They began to break away and say, since we cannot receive orders as we used to, paint to order and get magnificent sums for it, we are going to paint what we please. And probably that's the whole beginning of the development of modern art and all its revolutionary tendencies, starting from the Impressionists, who scandalized their public, down through the Post-Impressionists, the Fauves, that is, the wild men who carried Impressionism a little bit further, using broader strokes in their painting and more separated colors. Finally, the Cubists, who broke away from the idea of color or any scientific breaking up of tones entirely and produced a more, let us say, intellectual approach to their idea of painting. At the same time in Italy, Marinetti and the Futurists were agitating on their side, probably also influenced by the great revolution that was taking place in France at the time. And they developed Futurism. So the idea of revolt was in the air. During the First World War, a number of exiles met in Zurich, poets and painters, and as a protest against the collapse of society, tried also to bring about a collapse of the arts by attacking everything that was traditional, academic, or accepted by the installed dealers and collectors. That explains their scandalous action. It was a negative activity, let us say, since it was destructive of the arts in a way. They chose as their source of inspiration mostly hazard, chance. For instance, to make a poem, they would cut out a lot of words from a newspaper, jumble them up in a hat, and then as they picked them out one by one, would form their new poem. In painting also, they tore up scraps of paper and let them fall any which way on a sheet and then paste them down. In America, I was working in a slightly different manner. I still respected my technique because I felt that no matter how extravagant, how unusual the subject of inspiration, to convey it, one had to use a tried and expert technique to convey it or to impress the spectator with it. It has always been one of my quarrels with the Dadaists and the Surrealists that to realize a work, one should employ a sound technique, have a basis on which to work, even if it is an academic basis. And this has been more or less confirmed by the work of some of the best Surrealist painters whose technique is impeccable. However extravagant, however wild the source of inspiration may be, whether it's the dream world, whether it's automatism, whether it's hazard and chance, but the technique is absolutely essential to a realization of this source of inspiration. Of course, there had been some activity in New York of a public nature Since the Armory show in 1913, which showed all the different manifestations of art in Europe of the period, that encouraged us. And then right after the war, a group was founded in New York called the Société Anonyme, in which Duchamp and myself were the principal leaders, and we showed some of the Dada works that had come over. Kurt Schwitters, Compendonk, they were not exactly Dadaists, but they were what you would call expressionists, which was very closely related to the Dadaists. So we did show the things, and there were one or two galleries, like Montrose's, who invited us to have a show of our latest works. I sent in a large painting of mythical personages battling each other with gray horses. Somebody told me it looked like something that had been influenced by the Italian Uccello. I had never seen a Uccello painting in my life, but I said, well, if it looks like something that's been done before, that confirms its authenticity. That makes it all the more worthwhile. Duchamp was absolutely uncompromising. He sent in a typewriter cover and a snow shovel as his contribution. Also, a little chromo on which he had added simply a point of red and green, and which he entitled Pharmacy. The dealer who gave us his gallery for this show was quite embarrassed, but since he had offered us the gallery, he went through with this exhibition, and there was a little consolation when one of the critics observed that after all, Duchamp could pay when he wanted to, since there was a delicious little watercolor by him in this exhibition, referring to the chromo on which he'd added a couple of spots. My painting, the huge painting, which was supposed to remind one of Uccello, had something mechanical about it, according to the critics. Well, anyhow, this was an expression of Dadaism in our own terms. Things got worse, however. The critics became more and more antagonistic, the galleries less and less accessible, and I finally decided to leave New York. Duchamp Picabia had gone back, so I packed up whatever paintings I had and left for France. The first day I arrived, I was welcomed with open arms. All the Dadaists were there at the cafe where they usually met to receive me. I was brought in by Duchamp. None of us could understand each other, but we didn't have to. We were Dadaists. There was no language that was good enough for us to express ourselves or to communicate with one another. We went out to dinner together. We went to an open street fair after dinner and had a very fine time. I remember one of the Dadaists, as we walked along the street, rang the doorbells of all the houses along one of the streets, and when the janitor came out, this man Supo asked if Mr. Supo lived in this house. The janitor replied no, he was sorry, so Mr. Supo went on to the next door. And we weren't drunk either. All this was done very consciously. Another, I think it was Jacques Rigaud, a young Dadaist, climbed up on a lamppost. We gathered around. He made a very long speech, a Dadaistic speech to us. About 50 other people gathered around too, even a couple of policemen who didn't try to disperse us. It was all very amusing and very entertaining. But this was not the case when we gave a planned show in Paris, when all the Dadaists announced that they would give a grand presentation of the Dada process. Poems would be read, a play enacted, and all those who were interested could come to the theater to assist at this performance. Of course, there was an entry for it to be paid, and the theater was packed. Oh, I should also say that Sarah came to me the day before. I'd already begun to do a little photography, had made some abstract compositions in photography. Sarah came to me and said, "You've got to participate in this. Why not make a film for tomorrow night so we can project this film?" I said, "Yes, but a film takes some time to do." "Well, do it the way you do your abstract photographs. You know, just with anything, objects you have in the studio." I said, "All right." I got a couple of 100 feet of cinema film. I cut them up in pieces, laid it out on my table in the dark room, sprinkled it with salt and pepper, pins and needles, thumbtacks, bits of paper, developed it, stuck the pieces together, and we had a film for the Dada presentation the next day. The whistling began about 10 minutes after the show started because 12 poets started to read their poetry simultaneously. Oh, there were a lot of other things. There was the music, of course, much more advanced than any of the modern concrete music that we hear now and then. The audience began to whistle and boo, but still they kept their seats until my film was projected. Things began to jump on the screen, and the people began to jump around in the theater as well. One man shouted that he wanted his money back. Another one shouted to him to keep quiet, that if he didn't like it, he could leave. So the first man hauled off and hit him in the face. There was a free-for-all then. In the dark, everybody was lunging out to hit everybody else, and finally we all surged out of the theater, one seething mass. That was practically the end of Dadaism. We couldn't go any further, and there was a lull for a year or so while we reorganized our forces. Gradually, the idea of surrealism began to develop. Now, surrealism was a more constructive movement. I think it was influenced by the writings of Freud, psychology. The idea of going, as in Dadaism, to new sources of inspiration, the dream world, automatism, chance and hazard also figured, but it was quite different because a little more attention was paid to technique, which I had always insisted on. We tried to make our works look like genuine, almost academic works, so they could be put over with our ideas more effectively. A few magazines were started. The Surrealists managed to publish several magazines, and they were all read with a great deal of interest and seemed to influence the younger generations very much. People have been saying before that Dadaism was dead, but nobody knew it better than the Surrealists. Just as now, there are many people who are saying that Surrealism is dead. The Surrealists know that Surrealism is dead, but that's no reason for neglecting it. The people who criticize us in that sense do not neglect the old masters, although they are dead. So death is completely irrelevant to the subject, whether a thing is interesting or not. Let's admit that Surrealism is dead. It still has been a very potent factor. It has influenced the younger generation. It has entered the public domain, like Impressionism before it, like Cubism. Before leaving New York in 1921, we managed to publish a Dada magazine in New York. Only one issue appeared. It was more in an American spirit than in its counterpart in France. I took some clippings from newspapers, a few photographs I made, extravagant photographs. I was just beginning to make some photographs then. And poems chosen irrespective of their quality, was just to fill up the half a dozen pages of which this magazine consisted. There was no other issue, and it's become a collector's item now. I arrived in France in 1921 and immediately participated in all the activities of the Dadaists. Their magazines, their proclamations, their public presentations in theaters or halls, specially rented for the purpose. One might say that the Dada movement ended officially around 1923, and it was most of the same poets and painters who slid over into the Surrealist movement. But it would be not quite right to consider the Surrealist movement a continuation or an evolution of the Dada movement. It is exactly, in many respects, opposite, because it is constructive, whereas Dada was destructive of the contemporary arts. Surrealism tries to replace, not to annihilate. They ignore what's been done, except in very extreme, flagrant cases where academism or tradition seems to have too strong a hold on the public or to lull them. Surrealism also is a movement of revolt, but it chooses its own weapons, a new medium. While it has painters in its midst, I think it is primarily a literary movement, because the word counts for more than any plastic presentation. I said that recently to André Breton, who is the father of Surrealism, so-called. I believe that there is no such thing as Surrealist painting. It is the poets, the writers, who are Surrealists, who have put their fingers on certain works amongst our painters and have immediately called them Surrealist works. But they claim also no exclusivity in the matter. They have pointed out that through the ages there have always been Surrealists amongst writers and amongst painters. They have called Swift a Surrealist. They have called a painter like Uccello a Surrealist, because in their time they were revolutionary and going off at a tangent from the accepted course of their contemporaries. Now, if you will allow me, I shall become a little more personal. After all, it's the right of an ancient Dadaist and Surrealist. It is only in being very personal that one can identify himself with the rest of humanity. I want to read a little preface I wrote in which I think I have expressed my attitude toward painting and toward people. Here it is. Of all the questions asked, how do you do it is the one that should provoke the least response on the part of an artist. Now, if you ask me simply, what are you doing? I am all smiles and accommodating. I proceed at once to unload all my treasures and secret desires, even to the point of satiety, little caring whether in the end I shall exhaust you as well as my own patience. Rather have the questioner go away surfeited and wobbly than to have him stare between two works and ask again, is that all? No more? One is not sure whether he has not had enough or whether he is merely being polite, so I take no chances. Pleasure and the pursuit of freedom are the guiding motives in all human activity. The pursuit of freedom is work. The pursuit of pleasure is the play. all learned opinions to the contrary. All criticism is destructive, most of all self-criticism. All work and all play are the signature of their authors. Would you have me change my signature or my sex? The world is full, is reeking with elements to suit your tastes and your desires. There is room for all. That most subversive of human activity, competition, exists the least in creative work. The artist is the only true sage. He comes to us with open mind and with open hands. When his work confronts others, he is not up for trial. It is a spectator of anyone who is putting himself on record. Time has proven this again and again.
Well, we've been listening to Man Ray as he recounts his career. We're going to hear the second half of that tape next Thursday at 5:30. You've been listening to MuseBeam. You can write us here at MuseBeam, WFMU, Uppsala College, East Orange, New Jersey, 07019. And I'm Bob Rixon, and thanks for listening in.
Hi, this is Joe Renner, and these are the Rixon tapes. Bob Rixon was a poet and broadcaster, a pioneer of freeform radio from 1981 at the FMU studios in New Jersey. He passed away on May 8th, 2014 at the age of 66. These tapes are a tribute to his work as a broadcaster and poet. Help this channel by hitting the subscribe button. Thank you very much.